Hey guys, tonight we begin with a group of Tudor-era women who treated moral codes like polite suggestions. The Tudor world was obsessed with virtue, chastity, and public image, which makes its scandals infinitely more entertaining. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's deliciously indecent history lesson together. Anne Boleyn didn't just break hearts. She broke the Catholic Church. That's not hyperbole. That's her dating resume. Before her, Henry VIII was your standard Renaissance monarch. Loud, vain, slightly dangerous, and married to a woman he'd stopped liking several feasts ago. Then Anne walked in, said no, and England hasn't been sober since. Anne wasn't beautiful, in the way poets described. She was magnetic, clever, and fluent in making powerful men act like idiots. She'd been educated in France, which, in Tudor terms, meant she knew how to flirt and read, both highly suspicious traits in a woman. When Henry tried his usual royal charm, Anne turned him down so politely that he mistook it for foreplay. For 7 years, he chased her like a lovesick teenager with a tax base, letters, gifts, promises, the works. He offered her jewels. She offered him patience. He offered her eternal love. She offered him a blank stare until he built her a church. Eventually, he took the hint and took England out of Rome. Their marriage began with fireworks and ended with accusations of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Basically, the full Tudor starter pack. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth I, which would have been fine if the baby hadn't been female. Henry wanted a son, a legacy, and someone to blame when things went wrong. Instead, he got a daughter who would later make him look like a footnote. Anne, for her part, didn't help her case. She was sharp, sarcastic, and refused to giggle at bad jokes, traits considered high treason in the 16th century. Rumors began, evidence was found, and suddenly she was sleeping with half the royal musicians. Even her brother got dragged into the mess, which is when, the court gossip mill had truly run out of logic. Her trial was a performance. Everyone already knew the ending. She stood tall, delivered a calm defense, and was executed with French precision. They called her immoral, manipulative, and wicked, which is exactly what every powerful woman gets called by men who can't control her. Anne didn't just seduce a king, she seduced destiny. And in doing so, she made England far kinkier, far bloodier, and frankly, far more interesting. If Anne Boleyn was the woman who made Henry VIII break the church, Catherine Howard was the one who made him lose his last shred of dignity. By the time she entered his life, Henry was middle-aged, overweight, and about as romantic as a sack of flour. Catherine, on the other hand, was a teenager, lively, naive, and raised in the kind of household that would make modern social services weep. She was the cousin of Anne Boleyn, which in hindsight should have been a red flag. The Howards had a type, beautiful, ambitious, and fatally attracted to bad decisions. Catherine was placed at court as a lady-in-waiting, which in Tudor England was essentially royal girlfriend auditions. Henry noticed her immediately, and she noticed his crown, or more likely, his treasury. Their courtship was brief, their wedding faster. By 1540, the young Catherine was queen, and Henry was convinced he'd rediscovered his youth. He called her his rose without a thorn. The poor man didn't realize roses bloom best in manure. Catherine played the part of the doting young wife beautifully. right up until she started sneaking around with a handsome courtier named Thomas Culper. It wasn't even discreet. Love notes were exchanged, meetings arranged, and rumors bloomed faster than Tudor syphilis. Meanwhile, an older ex-boyfriend named Francis Durham showed up demanding recognition. Always a solid career move when the husband is the king. When Henry found out, the transformation was biblical. The loving husband act vanished overnight. Catherine was dragged from Hampton Court, screaming, interrogated, and condemned for treason, which in Tudor vocabulary meant making the king look stupid. At her execution, she apologized for her sins and admitted she'd been more fond of pleasure than of virtue. Historians later debated whether she was innocent, foolish, or simply a teenager in the world's worst arranged marriage. The answer is probably all three. Catherine Howard was young, unprepared, and caught in the gravitational pull of a man who thought divorce was foreplay. She entered history as a cautionary tale, proof that in Tudor England, love could get you a crown, lust could get you killed, and being both could get you remembered. Before Anne Boleyn seduced Henry VIII into rewriting the Bible, her sister, Mary, got there first, quietly, efficiently, and without breaking a single commandment. Mary was the prototype, charming, flirtatious, and blissfully unconcerned with long-term consequences. She was sent to the French court as a teenager, which was basically Europe's most expensive finishing school for scandal. There, she allegedly enjoyed French education in every possible sense. Rumored lovers included King Francis I, who called her "my English mayor." That's not a metaphor. That's exactly how politely the Renaissance handled shaming. By the time she returned to England, Mary was already infamous for her diplomatic experience. Naturally, the Tudor court thought perfect wife material. She married a minor nobleman named William Carey, whose main function in history was standing nearby while the king slept with his wife. Because soon after, Henry noticed her, and when Henry noticed, careers ended. Their affair was relatively quiet by royal standards. No divorces, no executions, just discreet gifts, hushed gossip, and the occasional royal baby no one wanted to talk about. Mary gave birth to 2 children, one of whom, Henry Carey, bore such a striking resemblance to the king that even the portrait painters started coughing politely. But Mary wasn't a schemer. She lacked her sister Anne's ambition or her survival instinct. When Henry grew bored, he moved on, and Mary was left with fading beauty and expensive bills. While Anne became queen, Mary was gently kicked to the sidelines, where she committed her greatest scandal yet, marrying for love. Her second husband, William Stafford, was a soldier of modest rank and no fortune. The Tudor elite were horrified. A Boleyn marrying for affection. Disgusting. She was banished from court for degrading herself, which, given that she'd previously been the king's mistress, seems a little late for moral outrage. Mary lived the rest of her life quietly in the countryside, poor but reportedly happy. A rare ending for a Tudor woman. No beheading, no imprisonment, no papal bull, just peace, chickens, and the satisfaction of having outlived every single person who judged her. She started as a royal mistress and ended as a content wife, proving that sometimes the most perverted thing a Tudor woman could do was survive. Technically, Jane Shore belonged to the generation before the Tudor, but her legend was too scandalous for them not to steal. She was the original blueprint for every fallen woman's story that followed. Intelligent, beautiful, morally flexible, and doomed to become a sermon illustration, Jane began as the wife of a respectable London merchant, the kind of man who probably smelled like accounting. Then she caught the eye of King Edward IV, a monarch with more charm than discipline. Their affair was an open secret. The court adored her, The church despised her, and Edward treated her like she was England's national pastime. But unlike most royal mistresses, Jane wasn't greedy or manipulative. She was genuinely kind, a rare and fatal trait in a royal mistress. She used her influence to help the poor, pardon prisoners, and convince the king to stop executing people before breakfast. In a court built on cruelty, she was the anomaly, a good person in the wrong job. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, Jane's luck expired with him. Richard III took power and needed a scapegoat to make himself look holy. Jane, being attractive, outspoken, and recently unemployed, was perfect. He accused her of witchcraft, seduction, and general lewd behavior. Translation: she had standards and refused to fake sorrow. Over a tyrant, her punishment became legend. Forced to do public penance for her sins, she walked barefoot through London, wearing nothing but a thin white chemise, an outfit that managed to scandalize and entrance the crowd simultaneously. Chroniclers claim the public wept for her. Realistically, half of them fainted, and the rest followed her home. But Jane survived. She lived long enough to see herself turned into a moral lesson, then into a folk heroine, and finally into a cautionary ghost story, told by preachers who were secretly fascinated. Her true crime wasn't adultery. It was having a personality in a century that preferred women to be silent, ugly, and replaceable. Jane Shore never set out to become England's most famous penitent. But when the church tried to humiliate her, she turned repentance into theatre. And as every tutor would later learn, a well-staged sin lasts longer than any virtue. Every royal court needs at least one woman who flirts with her pen. And in Henry VII's court, that was Mary Shelton, a lady-in-waiting who could turn innuendo into literature, and literature into trouble. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, which already meant she was genetically predisposed to scandal. The Binns weren't a family so much as a dynasty of flirtation. They could cause a political crisis just by making eye contact. Mary fit right in, witty, educated, and fluent in the universal Tudor language of accidental double meaning. Her poems, preserved in the Devonshire manuscript, were an elegant cocktail of love, sarcasm, and mild filth. On paper, they were about faith and longing. In practice, they read like Tudor pick-up lines, with better vocabulary. She once wrote, "When I remember your parting face, mine heart doth ache in every place," which is beautiful until you realize parting face might not mean what your high school English teacher thinks it does. Mary's verses were passed around court like gossip disguised as art. The Tudor elite adored poetry that sounded moral but felt indecent. It made sinning feel sophisticated. Her lines whispered of forbidden glances, lost kisses, and other things that would have earned her an exorcism if she'd been less charming. Rumor has it she also caught Henry's attention, though whether that was physical or poetic depends on how generous you feel toward Henry's reading comprehension. She was young, clever, and confident, three qualities he found both irresistible and deeply threatening. Fortunately, she never crossed the line into full mistress status, which probably saved her neck, literally. Mary Shelton was part of that rare breed of Tudor woman who could seduce without touching, insult without being punished, and survive without apologizing, while her more ambitious cousins were losing their heads. She was writing poems about heartbreak and probably laughing at everyone else's fate. History forgets most female poets of the 16th century, but Mary left her mark in ink, sharp, scandalous, and centuries ahead of her time. She never ruled a kingdom, but she conquered something arguably more difficult, staying witty, alive, and just perverted enough to make her poems immortal. Every Tudor scandal needs an accessory, and few wore that title better than Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. She was the kind of woman who could enter a room quietly and leave it on fire. Intelligent, observant, and terminally nosy, Jane didn't start scandals. She just poured oil on them and took notes. She married George Boleyn. Yes, that Boleyn, Anne's brother, a man whose charm didn't quite survive contact with reality. Their marriage was famously miserable. She found him arrogant. He found her exhausting. Somewhere between the insults and the silences, Jane decided that if she couldn't be loved, she might as well be feared. When her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn fell from grace, Jane stepped forward as a helpful witness. She testified that Anne and George were a little too close, and her words helped send them both to the chopping block. Historians still debate whether she did it out of jealousy, revenge, or just a spectacular lack of self-awareness. Whatever her motives, Jane became that rarest of creatures, a Tudor woman who survived someone else's downfall. For a while, she kept her head down. Then along came Catherine Howard, Henry's teenage wife, and Jane thought, I could be useful again. She became the young queen's confidant, which in Tudor terms meant she carried messages, arranged secret meetings, and kept watch while Catherine indulged in extracurricular diplomacy with Thomas Culper. When the affair was discovered, Jane tried to act surprised, which was impressive given that she had literally helped schedule it. The interrogation didn't go well. Under pressure, she broke down, ranted incoherently, and briefly went insane, which delayed her execution because it was considered impolite to behead lunatics. Once she recovered enough to stand upright, they killed her anyway. At her beheading, she apologized for slandering the innocent queen, meaning Anne. It was the 16th century version of I may have gone too far. Jane Boleyn's life reads like a cautionary tale, written by someone who hated subtlety. Betray one queen, destroy another, lose your mind, and die on a cold February morning. In a court filled with liars, she was simply better at it until she wasn't. If Tud to England had a LinkedIn, Elizabeth Bess Holland would have listed her profession as mistress of influence and selective morality. She wasn't royal, noble, or particularly well-born, but she had one talent that mattered in the 16th century. She understood how men in power thought, and she knew exactly how to make them forget it. Bess became the mistress of Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man, the original bureaucratic shark who dismantled monasteries and people with equal efficiency. Cromwell was cold, brilliant, and allergic to affection. Yet, he kept Bess close. Historians suggest she softened him. More likely, she reminded him that pleasure still existed between executions. At court, Bess became both admired and feared. She wore silk when others wore linen, smiled when others prayed, and collected secrets the way other women collected jewelry. She was rumored to have been helpful to more than one ambitious nobleman, though helpful in Tudor slang usually involved candlelight and regret. Cromwell's enemies whispered that Bess had too much access, too much influence, and far too little shame. That combination was fatal in a world where even queens got beheaded for looking smug. When Cromwell fell from grace, accused of treason, overreaching, and marrying Henry to the wrong woman, Bess vanished. One day she was draped in velvet. The next she was gone like spilled perfume. No trial, no record, just silence. Some say she fled abroad. Others believe she bribed her way into anonymity. A few romantic chroniclers insist she slipped into a convent, though the odds of Bess Holland volunteering for celibacy are roughly equal to Henry taking up veganism. What's certain is this: for a brief, glittering moment, she navigated the deadliest court in Europe, armed, with nothing but wit, charm, and an unshakable talent for survival. Bess never got her portrait, her title, or her happy ending. But she got something rarer. She lived in Tudor England. That was an achievement worth engraving on a tombstone. She remains the ghost of Cromwell's ambition. A courtesan in silk, forgotten by history, but remembered by every man who thought he could control her and learned otherwise. If ambition had a perfume in Tudor England, it would have smelled like an Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, expensive, cold, and faintly poisonous. She was the kind of woman who didn't smile unless it was strategic. Her beauty was famous, her composure legendary, and her reputation best described as frosty with a chance of execution. Anne married Edward Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, and the only one who managed to produce a legitimate son without getting divorced or beheaded. That made Edward the uncle of the future king, and Anne the queen of every corridor that mattered. She wore her new, status-like armor and treated the other ladies in waiting the way one treats unpaid interns, with mild contempt and sharp directions. When Edward became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector for the young Edward V, VI, and effectively became England's unofficial queen without any of the tedious humility that came with the actual crown. She built grand houses, hosted lavish feasts, and had her servants address her as Your Grace, with the kind of intensity that suggested they might not live long if they forgot. But beneath the icy polish was a woman who understood exactly how dangerous softness could be. The court called her cold-hearted, but that was mostly projection from men who didn't enjoy being outmaneuvered by someone wearing pearls. Anne knew how to use silence as a weapon and charm as camouflage. She wasn't scandalous in the traditional sense. No lovers, no drunken feasts, no secret letters. Her perversion was subtler. She lusted not for bodies, but for power. Of course, in Tudor England, a woman who didn't giggle or faint was automatically suspicious. When her husband fell from favor and was executed, Anne was thrown into the tower, her crime being herself too efficiently. She was later released, but the damage was done. Her influence melted faster than candle wax at midnight, and Seymour died quietly, which for a Tudor noblewoman counts as a miracle. She left behind no great lovers, no juicy scandals, just a reputation for being terrifyingly competent in a world that preferred its women beautiful, brainless, and expendable. In short, Anne didn't seduce men. She intimidated them, and somehow that was even more dangerous. By the time Catherine Parr arrived at court, Henry VIII had run out of both cartilage and wives. He was old, paranoid, and one ulcer away from a medieval fireworks display. Catherine, however, had the one quality none of his previous spouses possessed: common sense, which naturally made everyone suspicious. Catherine wasn't born to be a queen. She was a twice-widowed noblewoman who had spent her life quietly reading books, managing estates, and avoiding decapitation. She was intelligent, kind, and pious. 3 traits that in Tudor England were the social equivalent of waving a red flag at a bull wearing a mitre. When Henry proposed, Catherine politely accepted because saying no to the king usually resulted in a sudden interest in French architecture, namely the Tower of London. She became Henry's 6th wife in 1543 and immediately set about doing what no one else had managed, keeping him alive and relatively calm. She nursed his wounds, flattered his ego, and managed to smile convincingly while he compared her to his dead exes. But Catherine wasn't just a nursemaid with pearls. Beneath the modest gowns and psalms was a sharp political mind. She supported Protestant reform, published her own theological writings, a bold move when writing anything could get you executed, and debated religion with the king himself. Henry found this fascinating right up until he didn't. One evening, he reportedly muttered that he should have her arrested for heresy. Catherine, sensing that divine reasoning was losing to royal indigestion, quickly threw herself at his feet and said she'd only argued to distract him from his pain. Henry melted instantly. It was the 16th century version of "I was only joking." After Henry died, Catherine finally got what she'd always wanted: freedom. She married Thomas Seymour, the handsome, charming, and utterly untrustworthy brother of Jane Seymour. Unfortunately, she discovered that being a widow with money and a husband with ambition was only slightly less dangerous than being married to Henry himself. Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, having outlived Henry VIII and outsmarted nearly everyone else. She was the only Tudor queen who managed to leave the marriage alive. Literate and still mildly sarcastic, which statistically speaking makes her the period's biggest success story. In a court full of loud scandals, Elizabeth Bessie Blount managed to become Henry VIII's mistress without setting the palace on fire. A rare achievement in an age when seducing the king usually led to public humiliation or sudden widowhood. Bessie was beautiful, charming, and most dangerously agreeable. Historians like to call her modest. What they really mean is smart enough to know when to stop talking. She first appeared at court as one of Queen Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting, a position that was basically the Tudor equivalent of being an unpaid intern in proximity to disaster. Henry noticed her during a dance, which was both flattering and deeply unsafe. He liked her grace, her youth, and above all the fact that she didn't argue with him about theology. Their affair was short, sweet, and surprisingly scandal-free. No public letters, no temper tantrums, no continental wars. Bessie understood the first rule of royal romance: never outshine the monarch. She was discreet to the point of invisibility, which ironically made her irresistible. When she became pregnant, the entire court pretended not to notice, which is impressive considering subtlety wasn't really the Tudor brand. In 1519, she gave birth to Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate child, a name so grand it sounds like he came pre-packaged with a crown. Henry adored the boy, showered him with titles, and even considered making him heir. For a brief moment, Bessie's son stood on the edge of destiny until he died young, as most Tudor heirs inconveniently did. As for Bessie, she handled motherhood and royal discard with equal composure. Henry rewarded her with a nice marriage to a quiet gentleman named Gilbert Taleboy, essentially the Renaissance version of an early retirement package. She bore him more children, avoided gossip, and lived long enough to see her more ambitious successors lose their heads, literally. Bessie Blount wasn't a schemer or a saint. She was a woman who understood the dangerous mathematics of power. One affair, one son, and 0 executions, in the blood-soaked soap opera of Tudor England, that made her practically a genius. While others chased crowns, Bessie chose survival. And in Henry's England, that was the most seductive move of all. If Tudor England were a chessboard, Frances Howard would have been the queen who smiled sweetly while knocking over all the other pieces. Born into the powerful Howard clan, professional survivors of royal mood swings, Frances was raised on court politics, gossip, and the unshakable belief that sin is just strategy with better lighting. Her story unfolded during the tail end of the Tudor age, when the crown had passed to the morally exhausted stewards, but the court's appetite for scandal hadn't dimmed one bit. Frances was young, stunning, and inconveniently married to a man she despised. Robert de Rou, the Earl of Essex, who, despite his title, had all the sexual charisma of a damp tapestry. Bored and beautiful is a dangerous combination. Frances fell in love with Robert Carr, the king's favourite, which in plain English means the man His Majesty liked to flirt with while pretending not to. To be with Carr, Frances needed an annulment, an in-Tudor law that required proof her marriage hadn't been consummated. So she told the court that her husband could not perform. Then, just to prove it, she allegedly smuggled in a substitute woman for him to fail with in front of witnesses. Imagine the world's worst dinner party, but with legal implications. Her annulment succeeded, and she married Carr. For a while, it looked like a fairy tale, until a man named Sir Thomas Overbury wrote a poem calling her immoral. Naturally, she poisoned him. When caught, she denied everything, then admitted it, then insisted it was justified. This strategy didn't win her friends, but it did get her imprisoned in the Tower with her husband. Most Tudor women in that situation ended up beheaded or forgotten. Frances, however, flirted her way into a royal pardon. She and Carr were released, disgraced, but alive, which statistically counts as a victory in Tudor England. She lived quietly afterward, occasionally popping up in gossip as a fallen woman turned devout. Whether that was genuine repentance or just another performance, we'll never know. Frances Howard was proof that in a world run by men, the most perverted thing a woman could do was refuse to play the victim and still get away with it. If you wanted to map out Henry VII's family tree, Margaret Douglas would sit somewhere near the top, probably rolling her eyes. She was his niece, the granddaughter of Henry VII, and therefore royal enough to be important, but not quite important enough to be safe. In Tudor England, that was like being born holding a target. Margaret had beauty, charm, and the kind of romantic instincts that make biographers sigh heavily. Her life was a sequence of forbidden love stories, each ending in prison, scandal, or both. She treated royal bloodlines the way other people treated horoscopes. Interesting, but not a deal breaker. Her first great disaster was Lord Thomas Howard, uncle to Anne Boleyn and professional bad idea. Their romance bloomed while Henry VIII was busy dismantling his own marriage. The king, never fond of being upstaged in matters of love, declared their engagement treasonous. Both were imprisoned in the Tower. Thomas died there, while Margaret got out after promising not to fall in love again. Naturally, she immediately did. Her second affair with Charles Howard got her locked up again. You'd think she'd have learned, but Margaret had the soul of a poet and the self-preservation instincts of a candle in a gale. Every man she chose was either politically, radioactive, or already claimed. The woman had a type, and that type was career-ending. Still, Margaret wasn't stupid, just stubborn. She understood that love was both her weapon and her weakness, and she wielded it accordingly. Later in life, she became the matriarch of a dynasty that would outlast all her tormentors. Her grandson, James V, 6th of Scotland, would eventually become James I of England, uniting the crowns that had destroyed half her family. So yes, the woman who spent her youth flirting herself into prison became the grandmother of a king who ruled both kingdoms. Not bad for someone whose hobbies included treasonous romance and stubborn survival. Margaret Douglas's story reads like a Tudor version of a tragic comedy, too royal to be ignored, too passionate to behave, and too smart to stay quiet. In a world where one wrong glance could cost a head, she blinked deliberately twice and somehow kept hers. If you wanted to make Elizabeth I furious, all you had to do was exist beautifully, quietly, and with red hair. Unfortunately for Lettice Knollys, she did all three. Lettice was Elizabeth's cousin, and inconveniently her mirror image. She shared the same Tudor blood, the same golden complexion, and the same talent for turning powerful men into fools. In another life, she might have been Elizabeth's best friend. Instead, she became the Queen's living nightmare. Younger, married to the Queen's secret crush, and very much alive. The man in question was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's lifelong favourite. The maybe-lover historians still argue about when he secretly married Lettuce in 1578. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Imagine marrying your boss's boyfriend and then showing up to work the next day wearing his coat. Elizabeth handled the news with her usual regal composure, meaning she screamed, banished Lettuce from court, and referred to her as the she-wolf. Dudley was forgiven, of course. Tudor England had a long-standing policy of blaming women for men's enthusiasm. But Lettuce wasn't the weeping type. She simply retreated to her estates, draped herself in velvet, and lived like a queen without the paperwork. Her marriage to Dudley, by all accounts, was affectionate, though she did inherit his massive debts, his enemies, and his reputation for mismanaging everything he touched. Still, she kept her head, a genuine accomplishment in a family that lost several. After Dudley's death, she married again to a younger soldier named Sir Christopher Blount. This did not improve her standing with Elizabeth, who was now both jealous and elderly, a dangerous combination. When Blount joined a rebellion against the crown, Lettuce was briefly imprisoned for suspicion of sympathy, which is royal code for the Queen still hates you. And yet she outlasted them all. Elizabeth died childless. Lettuce lived to 88, an absurd age in Tudor England, mostly sustained by spite. Lettuce Knollys was proof that you didn't need a throne to rule. You just needed good bone structure, better husbands, and the patience to wait until your enemies died first, which fortunately they always did. Few women in history have been both saint and scandal, but Mary, Queen of Scots, somehow managed to be both, often in the same week. Born to rule and raised to ruin expectations, she lived like she was being graded on drama. If Elizabeth I was icy calculation, Mary was fire in human form, beautiful, impulsive, and allergic to good decisions. She became queen at 6 days old, which sounds impressive until you realize it just meant she inherited a country full of angry men in skirts. The Scots adored her in theory and conspired against her in practice. After being married off to the French Dauphin, she spent her youth in Paris learning how to charm courtiers, quote Latin, and outdress everyone within 50 miles. When her French husband died young, Mary returned to Scotland, a widow, a queen, and crucially still fabulous. Her next marriage to Lord Darnley looked good on parchment, handsome, noble, Catholic. In reality, he was a jealous drunk with the emotional stability of curdled milk. When he accused her of adultery, Mary's patience snapped faster than his sobriety. Not long after, Darnley's house mysteriously exploded, and someone also helpfully strangled him, just to be sure. Subtlety was not the Scots' strong suit. Entered James Bothwell, the rugged noble who rescued Mary from danger by allegedly kidnapping her, though accounts suggest she didn't resist very hard. Their scandalous marriage united Scotland in outrage, even for Tudor standards. Marrying your husband's prime murder suspect was considered bold. Rebellions followed. Mary fled and she sought shelter in England. An idea so catastrophically bad it deserves its own monument. Elizabeth I received her cousin warmly, then locked her up for 19 years. Mary spent nearly 2 decades under house arrest, embroidering, praying, and occasionally plotting the Queen's assassination. When Elizabeth finally executed her, Mary wore red, the color of martyrdom, and presumably defiance. History remembers her as tragic, sensual, reckless, a queen who confused love for destiny and romance for strategy. But to be fair, her story ended exactly as she lived, loudly, beautifully, and one dramatic gesture away from sainthood. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't rule her fate. She seduced it, and fate predictably couldn't resist. If the Tudor dynasty were a tragic play, Elizabeth would be the final act, the one where everyone's dead, the stage is on fire, and somehow the last character still looks impeccable. They called her the Virgin Queen, though history has been winking at that title for 5 centuries straight. Elizabeth inherited a nation that was broke, divided, and traumatized by her father's marital hobbies. Her childhood resume included watching her mother beheaded, her stepmothers vanish mysteriously, and her own imprisonment by her sister. By the time she became queen, she'd learned the 2 most important Tudor survival skills: trust no one and accessorize like your life depends on it. She was brilliant, cunning, and allergic to marriage proposals. Every European prince tried Spain, France, even the Holy Roman Empire. But Elizabeth treated matrimony like it was the plague. Her stock answer was, "I am married to England," which sounds noble until you realize England was the most demanding husband imaginable. Still, the gossip never stopped. Her relationship with Robert Dudley, the dashing Earl of Leicester, remains one of history's favorite will-they-won't. They tragedies. He was charming, handsome, and married, a trifecta of Tudor danger. When his wife conveniently fell down a staircase and broke her neck, Elizabeth's court whispered murder. The Queen handled it like a professional by pretending not to hear anything. For all her talk of chastity, Elizabeth surrounded herself with handsome courtiers who wrote her poetry so steamy it would have made a monk sweat. Yet she maintained her image as untouchable, the eternal flirt who never crossed the line. Historians still debate whether that restraint was virtue, calculation, or simply excellent time management. Her reign was long, glorious, and occasionally psychotic. She crushed the Spanish Armada, funded pirates she called privateers, and bankrupted herself on gowns, jewels, and flattery. When she died in 6003, unmarried and childless, she left behind an empire and about 10,000 unanswered rumors. Elizabeth's so-called virginity was her greatest political weapon. It made her sacred, desirable, and impossible to control. She didn't need a husband. She made an entire continent compete for the title. The Tudor line ended with her, but her legend didn't. The Virgin Queen never gave herself to anyone, which in a way means she owned everyone. Before death rolled down from the mountain, Pompeii was just another lively Roman town basking in the southern sun. The morning began like any other. The streets clattered with iron-rimmed wheels, bakers hauled loaves from smoky ovens, and the fountains splashed cool water for slaves carrying amphu. The air smelled of olive oil, perfume, and fish sauce, the everyday scent of prosperity. Mount Vesuvius loomed in the distance, green and serene, its slopes covered with vineyards that produced the region's beloved wine. Nobody feared it. In fact, they worshipped it. To the Romans, Vesuvius was a symbol of fertility, not destruction. Wealthy citizens prepared for a day of business and leisure. In the Forum, magistrates debated taxes under marble porticos. Across town, a gladiator wiped oil from his arms as he trained for the evening's games. Artists painted fresco on villa walls, capturing lovers, gods, and myths that seemed eternal. Even the brothel were open for business before noon. Pompeii was nothing if not efficient. In Herculaneum, the smaller coastal town, fishermen mended their nets by the sea, laughing as children splashed in the shallows. Smoke rose from kitchen hearths, where women simmered lentils and salted anchovies. The sun climbed higher, and the heat shimmered off the paving stones. Everything appeared perfectly normal until the dogs began to bark. Around midday, subtle tremors shook the ground. The locals barely noticed. Minor earthquakes were common in Camper, but the shaking didn't stop. Birds scattered from rooftops, and a faint rumble echoed from the mountain. Some paused and looked up just for a moment before shrugging it off. Life resumed its rhythm. By early afternoon, the air grew oddly still. A faint sulphurous smell drifted through the markets, mingling with the scent of figs and wine. Farmers on the slopes saw the first puff of dark smoke curling from Vesuvius Peak. They assumed it was another small fire, perhaps a shepherd's signal, but that smoke would not clear. It would climb, spread, and darken the sky. For now, though Pompeii and Herculaneum carried on, unaware that this ordinary summer morning would soon be frozen in ash, preserved forever as the last perfect moment before the world ended. It began with a sound, not thunder, but something deeper, a low, continuous groan, like the earth itself exhaling after centuries of silence. Birds vanished, dogs whimpered and bolted through the streets. Then came the first explosion. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the summit of Mount Vesuvius cracked open. A jet of black smoke and molten debris shot upward with terrifying force, forming a vast column that clawed into the blue sky. Pliny the Younger, writing from across the bay in MC Nom, described it as a pine tree rising to the heavens, its trunk the pillar of smoke, its branches the spreading clouds of ash. Within minutes, daylight began to fade. Pompons flooded the streets, craning their necks toward the mountain. At first, there was confusion more than fear. Some citizens pointed, marveling at the spectacle, a fiery omen, a sign from the gods. Others ran to temples, offering hurried prayers to Jupiter and Vulcan, desperate for meaning in the chaos. Housewives gathered valuables, while fathers argued whether to stay or flee. Nobody truly understood what was happening. Then came the ash. Fine, grey particles began to fall like snow. At first, people laughed, brushing it from their hair and tunics, but soon the flakes thickened, darkening the air and clogging throats. The sun vanished completely behind a rolling curtain of black. Torches were lit, but even their flames seemed to shiver in the suffocating dust. By the second hour, roofs began to creak under the growing weight of pumice stones. The noise was unbearable. The hissing of falling ash, the thunder of distant eruptions, the screams of people and animals. The wind carried the choking sulphur across Camper. Those who tried to flee found the roads buried and the air unbreathable. Still, some stayed behind, convinced it would pass. After all, the mountain had been calm for generations. Perhaps the gods were angry, but surely they would forgive soon. But the column rising from Vesuvius was no ordinary eruption. It was 20 miles high and growing, feeding a rain of molten rock and fire that would not stop for 18 hours. The people of Pompeii had witnessed the first omen and failed to understand that the end had already begun. By midday, the mountain's fury was absolute. The sky over Pompeii had turned from blue to a dense, bruised grey. The sun vanished behind the volcanic cloud, and the city fell into an eerie twilight. People stumbled through the streets, covering their mouths with cloth, their eyes streaming from the sulphur. Every breath tasted of burnt stone and smoke. The ash no longer fell gently. It came down like hail, thick and hot, coating every surface in grey powder. Roofs bowed. Statues disappeared beneath the weight. Inside houses, families huddled together with oil lamps, listening to the muffled roar that never stopped. Each hour it grew louder, like an endless thunderstorm trapped inside the earth. Doors and windows rattled. The wealthy tried to flee with their jewels and servants, but the streets were buried ankle-deep in ash and pumice. Wagons overturned, horses collapsed in terror. There was nowhere to go. Every road led back to the mountain's wrath. Then came the lightning. Flashes of fire danced within the volcanic plume, illuminating the chaos below. Some swore they saw the gods themselves in the sky. Jupiter hurling bolts in anger, Vulcan hammering deep beneath the crater. Superstition spread faster than the smoke. Priests shouted prayers. Others tore their tunics, begging for mercy. But the gods had gone silent. In Herculaneum, closer to the sea, the situation was different, but no less dire. The winds spared them from the ash for now, but the earth shook violently. Walls cracked. The sea began to retreat from the shore as if drawn by some unseen force. Fishermen ran toward the beach in confusion, not realizing the water was gathering for something far worse. Back in Pompeii, darkness deepened. The streets filled with cries of mothers clutching children, of men calling for lost relatives, of animals trapped in stalls. Some sought shelter in temples, others dug trenches hoping to wait it out. A few with grim determination went back home to protect what they owned, unaware they were sealing their tombs. The air was now unbreathable, the world shrinking to a few feet of visibility. Ash covered everything, homes, bodies, dreams, until Pompeii itself began to disappear beneath the mountain it once adored. By the time night should have fallen, it was already darker than night. The volcanic column over Vesuvius, now miles high, began to collapse under its own weight. From it came a storm of pumice stones, burning fragments of rock, and molten debris hurled down upon the city. Each impact echoed like hammer blows. Roofs caved in, porticos splintered. The proud marble temples of Pompeii cracked and crumbled under the assault. People ran blindly through the chaos, clutching torches that did nothing against the suffocating blackness. Some tied pillows to their heads for protection. Others hid beneath tables or in cellars. The air glowed red, flickering with bursts of lightning trapped within the swirling ash. The gods no longer seemed angry. They seemed absent altogether. Only the mountain spoke now, and its voice was endless thunder. Across the city, chaos turned to desperation. Streets became rivers of pumice, rising fast and hot. Slaves tried to free their masters' carriages, but the wheels stuck in the accumulating debris. Families shouted to one another through walls already cracking from the tremors. One man dragged his elderly father through the streets, both coughing blood from the sulfur. Another tied a cloth around his child's face and whispered a prayer, though his voice was drowned by the mountain's roar. Then came the rocks, larger, heavier, deadly. Each one slammed into the ground with the force of a catapult. Anyone caught outside was crushed. The smell of burning oil, charred timber, and flesh filled the air. In the amphitheater, where crowds had once cheered gladiators, only silence remained, the ash falling evenly over the marble seats like a burial shroud. In Herculaneum, the situation took a sinister turn. The retreating sea had exposed the seabed, littered with gasping fish. Many ran toward it in wonder, just as a wall of steam and fire surged back from the horizon. The first pyrolastic surge racing toward the shore. It was over in seconds. Those who saw it never had time to scream. Back in Pompeii, the people huddled in their homes believed the worst had passed. They were wrong. The rain of fire was only the beginning. Beneath the ash, something far deadlier was forming. An invisible tide of heat and gas that would sweep everything away. As dawn approached, though no one could see it, Vesuvius unleashed its deadliest weapon. The massive column that had risen miles into the air finally collapsed. What followed was not lava, nor fire from above, but a rolling avalanche of death. A pyrelastic surge, superheated gas, ash, and stone, traveling faster than any horse could run. It moved silently at first, then with a sound like 1,000 chariots charging downhill. In Herculaneum they heard it too late. Survivors who had fled to the shoreline saw the wave of smoke descend from the mountain, glowing from within like molten glass. The heat, over 400 C, turned flesh to ash before screams could form. Dozens took refuge in the boathouses, huddling together in the dark, clutching one another as the blast hit. Their bodies would remain there for nearly 2,000 years, perfectly preserved in agony. The surge did not stop. It raced down the mountain's flank, incinerating everything in its path. Vineyards, olive groves, and villas vanished. When it reached Pompeii, it tore through the city like a god's breath. Roofs ripped away, walls exploded, bodies thrown across rooms. Those who had survived the night's bombardment now faced instant death. There was no escape, no mercy. The very air became a weapon, dense and boiling. Inside one villa, a group of people covered their faces with cloths, praying the storm would pass. In a single instant, they were frozen, their lungs scorched, their outlines sealed in ash. A woman clutching a child, a man shielding his wife, a dog chained by its collar. All preserved, immortalized in terror. Above them, Vesuvius thundered again, sending another surge, sweeping through what was left. The mountain's power seemed endless, its fury absolute. The once thriving city that had pulsed with laughter and trade was now a grey wasteland of twisted shapes and collapsed roofs. By the time the final waves hit, Pompeii was gone. The gods of Rome, Jupiter, Venus, Apollo, were silent beneath 30 feet of ash. The world above would forget the names of its victims. But the mountain remembered, and beneath its grey tomb, the people of Pompeii lay waiting, statues in the dust, frozen in the instant life turned to history. When the roaring finally ceased, an eerie calm settled over the Bay of Naples. The sky, once filled with fire and thunder, now hung heavy and still, a grey haze that dimmed the morning light. The air riot of sulphur and death. Ash drifted across the sea like snow, covering boats that floated silently, their oars abandoned. The world had gone quiet, too quiet. From Misenum across the bay, the Roman admiral, Pliny the Elder, watched the mountain's wrath from the deck of his ship. The previous night he had sailed out with a fleet to rescue those trapped along the coast. But as the first pyrelastic surges struck Herculaneum, his ships were forced to turn back. The sea boiled, the wind vanished, and an oppressive darkness swallowed the horizon. He never returned. Witnesses later said he collapsed near Stabia, suffocated by toxic fumes. A man of science, consumed by the very curiosity that made him great. The survivors who managed to escape the region stumbled through an unrecognizable landscape. Vineyards were gone. Rivers had changed course. Entire towns had vanished beneath layers of ash so thick that even roads disappeared. Farmers searching for their homes found only hills of grey where villages once stood. The mountain loomed above them still, its peak torn open and steaming like a wound that would never heal. For days the ash continued to fall, smothering everything within miles. The few who returned to dig through the ruins found only silence, the faint outline of doorways, the occasional charred beam, the ghostly impressions of the dead. They whispered that the gods had buried Pompeii for its sins, that Venus herself had turned away from the city that had worshipped her in name, but not in virtue. As weeks passed, nature began its quiet reclaiming. Grass sprouted through cracks in the ash. Birds returned cautiously. The memory of the eruption began to fade into rumor. A warning turned into myth. The empire moved on. Rome itself barely noticed. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum slipped beneath history's surface, sealed in their ashen tombs, and for almost 17 centuries they slept, waiting for the day when their story would rise again from the dust. Centuries passed. Grass grew over the buried towns, and the memory of Pompeii faded into legend. Farmers plowed fields over the ash, unaware that beneath their feet lay entire streets, frozen in the moment of death. The mountain, now quiet and deceptively calm again, became part of the landscape once more. Travelers passing through Campia saw only fertile soil and olive groves, never imagining the vast necropolis sleeping below. By the Middle Ages, the name Pompeii had vanished from maps. The Romans who survived the disaster had long since died, and their descendants no longer knew where the city had stood. Some believed it had been swallowed by the sea. Others whispered that the gods had buried it on purpose as punishment for arrogance. And so the mountain was left alone, its story buried as deeply as its victims. Then, in 1599, a canal digger unearthed something strange. Frescoed walls, bones, and strange inscriptions beneath the volcanic earth. But the discovery frightened more than it fascinated. The workers sealed the site again, fearing the wrath of the gods. It would take another century for curiosity to triumph over superstition. In 1748, under the reign of Charles III of Bourbon, systematic excavations began. What they uncovered stunned the world. Entire villas emerged, their paintings still vibrant, their mosaics intact. Bronze statues stood in courtyards, undisturbed since that final day of 79 CE. Bread still sat in ovens, carbonized, but perfectly shaped. Dogs still lay chained to doorposts, and bodies, hundreds of them, appeared in lifelike poses, the expressions on their faces frozen in that last breath. Archaeologists poured plaster into the hollow spaces left by decayed flesh, revealing hauntingly human figures. A mother shielding her child, a man covering his mouth, a couple locked in a final embrace. Pompeii was reborn, not as a city of the living, but as a ghost preserved in stone. The rediscovery of Pompeii offered something no text or scroll ever could. A direct glimpse into Roman life, its beauty, its excess, and its fragility. The city that once died in silence began to speak again, whispering its warnings through cracked walls and ashdan fresco, that nature never forgets, and time, no matter how long, always uncovers the truth. Pompeii's rediscovery didn't just reveal ruins, it revealed people. Every fresco, mosaic, and plaster cast spoke in the language of tragedy and beauty. Scholars and artists who walked those silent streets in the 18th and 19th centuries described the experience as visiting a city caught between life and death. The echoes of laughter, footsteps, and market cries seemed to linger in the air, preserved under centuries of silence. Walls still bore the graffiti of everyday Romans, love notes, insults, and political slogans, all untouched by time. One inscription read, "Gas Pomadius Cephalus was here," scratched into plaster nearly 2 millennia earlier. Others were more humorous. "If anyone sits here, let him read this before he dies. Drink wine, be merry." The wit of a people long dead survived their bodies. Pompeii was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a diary written by the doomed. But as more of the city was uncovered, fascination began to mingle with discomfort. The plaster figures, locked forever in the moment of death, were too human. Mothers, slaves, children, and lovers, their expressions clear and heartbreaking. Visitors came to stare. Some moved to tears, others morbidly curious. Museums filled with relics, silver cups, jewelry, even carbonized loaves of bread. Each one a silent testament to ordinary lives abruptly halted. By the late 19th century, Pompeii had become a symbol of impermanence, a warning carved in ash. Writers and poets came to walk its streets. Dickens, Goethe, Twain. They found in the ruins both horror and intimacy, a civilization that had everything and lost it in a single day. Artists painted it as a romantic tragedy. Scientists studied it as a geological marvel, yet beneath every interpretation, the same unease lingered that what happened once could happen again. And indeed, it could. Vesuvius still smoked quietly on the horizon, its slopes now dotted with villages. Locals farmed the same soil that had buried their ancestors. Tourists admired the view without thinking too long about what slept below. The mountain, patient and silent, waited. For in the ruins of Pompeii, one truth endured, that human brilliance and fragility are forever entwined, and that, beneath beauty, the earth remembers everything. Today, Mount Vesuvius stands quiet, deceptively so. Its slopes are green again, lined with vineyards that produce the same wine once poured in pomp in taverns. Tourists hike to its rim, peer into the crater, and snap photos where gods once breathed fire. To the casual eye, it seems peaceful, a sleeping giant that has long since surrendered its rage. But beneath that serene facade lies a cauldron still alive, simmering in silence. Scientists know this. The magma chamber hasn't cooled. It waits. At its feet, modern Naples bustles, a city of millions living in the shadow of ancient death. Children play soccer on the same plains where ash once fell like snow. Farmers plow fields that hide the bones of emperors' subjects. Each year, tremors ripple through the region, reminders that the earth is not as stable as it looks. Locals shrug them off, just as the Romans did in 79 CE. Human memory is short, and the mountain is patient. Volcanologists monitor it constantly. Sensors buried deep record. Its every pulse, its every whisper. Maps outline evacuation zones. Plans are drawn and redrawn. But even experts admit, if Vesuvius were to erupt again, there would be chaos. The population around it is far greater now than in Roman times. The fertile land that once sustained an empire still tempts those who choose to live close enough to lose everything again. And yet, Vesuvius remains strangely magnetic. Pilgrims of history and curiosity climb its slopes to gaze upon the plains where two cities vanished. From above, they can still trace Pompeii's outline. Streets, walls, amphitheaters, a fossilized heartbeat of Rome's golden age. The silence there feels heavy, almost reverent. The city may be gone, but its story pulses stronger than ever. The eruption of 79 CE was more than a tragedy. It was a mirror. It showed that civilizations, however powerful, exist on borrowed time. That beauty, art, and order can vanish in an instant. Vesuvius sleeps now, its breath hidden beneath centuries of calm. But its shadow stretches through time, reminding us that beneath every moment of peace, the world's fire still burns, unseen, waiting, eternal. Long before the crowds screamed his name, Scorpus was nothing. A slave boy born into dust and danger. He wasn't born in Rome, but likely in Hispania, a far province where fate had cruel hands. Captured or sold into servitude, he was trained young for the violent ballet of the Circus Maximus, the arena where horses, wheels, and men blurred into thunder. There, boys like him were molded into racers, their childhood traded for speed. The life of a charioteer was no child's game. Training began before sunrise. Scorpus learned to control for horses, the quadriga, while balancing on a wooden platform no wider than a door. One slip and you'd be dragged to death, your body crushed beneath the hooves. The instructors were ruthless. The arena did not forgive mistakes, and neither did Rome. He was property, a tool for entertainment. But in the empire, even a slave could chase glory. Charioteers, who survived long enough, could earn their freedom and unimaginable wealth. The factions that ruled the circus, the reds, blues, greens, and whites, were more than sporting teams. They were empires of their own, each with patrons, political influence, and fanatic supporters who painted city walls with slogans of devotion. Scorpus began in the stables of one of these factions, shoveling manure, grooming horses, and watching races from the shadows. But the boy had something others didn't: precision, nerve, and a terrifying calm under chaos. He could read a horse's breathing, predict a rival's mistake, and turn the chariot's reins like an artist flicking a brush. When he finally entered his first race, the crowd hardly noticed him, a nameless slave among legends. But when the gates opened and the horses exploded into motion, Scorpus handled his reins with impossible grace. He took the inside curve so tight that even veterans flinched. Dust rose, wheels screamed, and by the final lap his name was on every tongue. He crossed the finish line not as a slave, but as a promise, a new star in the making. The crowd roared his name, and for the first time Scorpus looked up at the imperial box and thought, maybe the gods have noticed me after all. The Circus Maximus, Rome's heartbeat, its madness, its addiction. It could hold 250,000 people, each one shouting, betting, praying for victory. To the crowd, chariot racing wasn't sport, it was religion. They wore their faction's colors like war paint, the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Men died for these colors. Riots broke out over them. Senators and slaves sat side by side, their eyes locked on the dust storm that was the track. For Scorpus, the circus was both a stage and a battlefield. Every race began with the same ritual: the creak of the starting gates, the blare of trumpets, the pounding of hooves. 7 laps, 1,200 meters each, and every inch could kill you. The trick wasn't just speed, it was nerve. The corners, the meat, were killers. Too wide, and you'd lose time. Too tight, and you'd crash, dragging your team and rivals into a tangle of reins and blood. Scorpus mastered those corners like few before him. He became known for his precision, the way his chariots seemed to brush death without fear. Crowds gasped when he cut the turn so close the wheel nearly kissed the post. His control was supernatural. Even veteran drivers stared in disbelief. To the people, Scorpus wasn't just a racer. He was possessed by the gods of speed. Themselves as victories piled up, so did the fame. His name appeared on graffiti across Rome. Scorpus, the pride of the Greens. Victory to Scorpus. Children carved it into walls. Vendors sold small clay figures of him and his horses. Fans chanted his name in taverns and argued about him in the baths. He was everywhere, the empire's first true celebrity athlete. But with fame came pressure. The factions were ruthless. If you lost, they replaced you. If you won, they worked you to exhaustion. Every race carried the risk of death. A snapped axle, a broken rein, a fall beneath the hooves. Scorpus knew it. He had seen too many friends dragged into the dirt. Yet he kept racing, kept winning, as if he were outrunning fate itself. The crowd adored him, and the gods, as always, were watching. To understand Scorpus, you had to understand his world. A city divided not by politics or class, but by colors. The factions ruled Rome's passions. The greens and the blues were the giants, their rivalries so fierce that they often spilled from the circus into the streets. Supporters brawled in taverns, sabotaged stables, and even bribed officials to fix races. The reds and whites lingered as lesser powers, but their fans were just as devoted. Scorpus rode for the greens, the faction of speed, style, and ruthless ambition. Their stables were filled with the empire's best horses, imported from Numidia and Hispania, animals worth more than villas. To win for the greens meant wealth, women, and immortality. To lose meant ridicule or worse. The pressure was relentless. The circus was a theater of extremes. Each faction had spies, mechanics, and even magicians who claimed to bless the race. Drivers were celebrities and targets. Sabotage wasn't uncommon. Reins cut, wheels tampered with, horses drugged. When Scorpus appeared at the gates, his fans erupted, waving green scarves and shouting his name like a war cry. He was their champion, their weapon against the blues, and the blues had theirs. Pompeius Musclusus, a veteran racer known for his cunning and brutality. Their duels became the talk of Rome. One race in particular became legend. The two men were neck and neck on the final lap, their chariots so close that the horses' mans brushed. Musclusus tried to cut Scorpus off at the turn, a deadly move, but Scorpus anticipated it. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled tighter to the post, scraping so close the crowd gasped. The blues' chariot shattered against the barrier. Scorpus flew ahead to victory, his tunic and face stir with blood and dust. The stands exploded. People threw garlands and coins into the track. The emperor himself rose to applaud. Rome had found its hero. But even as Scorpus basked in glory, he knew what that meant. Greater fame, greater envy, and greater danger. Because in the Circus Maximus, the crowd loved you only as long as you kept winning. And Scorpus, for all his brilliance, was racing toward a finish line no man could ever escape. By the time Scorpus reached his 20s, he was untouchable. Rome's fastest man, the darling of the green faction, and the face that sold every charm, amulet, and wine cup bearing his likeness. He had become what Rome had never truly seen before, a sports celebrity. Yet beneath the cheers and gilded rewards, his life remained chained to the same track that had first enslaved him. Each race was another roll of the dice with death. Charioteers tied the reins around their waists for better control, meaning a crash could drag them like ragdolls until they were pulped beneath the hooves. Scorpus had seen it happen countless times. The arena crews carried hooks specifically to drag the dead and dying off the course. Efficient, brutal, routine. Every morning he looked at those hooks and wondered how long before they would be for him. But still he raced. The more he won, the more the people demanded. Merchants sold tiny lead tokens stamped with his face, used for bets or as lucky charms. Children scratched his name into the walls. Scorpus brings victory. Wealthy patrons threw fortunes at him for sponsorships. He was a freeman now, but freedom in Rome was a performance. To stay adored, he had to keep winning. He pushed harder, racing more than anyone else, sometimes several times a day. His rivals began to fear him, but fear turned to hatred. Rumors spread that his horses were bewitched, that he bribed priests, that the greens fed him drugs for strength. In truth, he was simply obsessed. Winning was no longer about gold or fame. It was about proving that a slave could rise above the empire that had once owned him. The wear began to show. His body ached, his reflexes dulled, but he refused to slow down. Scorpus cannot lose, fans shouted, and he believed them. Each morning, as he stood in the chariot yard lacing the race, he stared at the mountain of wreaths, trophies, and gold plates that lined his chamber, proof of his immortality. Yet somewhere deep inside, he knew what every charioteer knew, but never said aloud. The circus didn't crown heroes, it devoured them, and Rome was always hungry for another fall. To understand Scorpus, you had to understand his horses. They were his partners, his weapons, his salvation. He drove a quadriga, 4 horses abreast. Names whispered across the empire like legends: Sella, Swift, Volusa, Flying One, Cottinus, and Sparsus. Each was trained for balance and precision, chosen not just for speed, but for temperament. The slightest panic in one could mean death for all. Every morning, Scorpus visited their stables before dawn. He spoke to them softly, running his hands over their manes, checking the straps himself. He knew their moods, their snorts, their rhythm. He didn't treat them as beasts, but as comrades. The bond between charioteer and horse was sacred, one built on trust forged in terror. In a race, the horses had to respond to the flick of his wrist, the pressure of a rein, or even a shouted word in the chaos of thunderous hooves. The greens spared no expense in training. The horses were bathed in olive oil, fed mixtures of barley and honey, and massaged after every run. Rome adored them almost as much as the drivers. Children could name them, poets praised them, but to Scorpus they were more than fame. They were family, the only beings who knew what it was like to fly on the edge of death. During races, Scorpus spoke to his team like a general commanding soldiers. He guided the leftmost horse, the finalist sinister, with a mix of tenderness and authority, keeping the team tight on the inner curve. It was a delicate balance of brutality and grace. When they moved, they became one, a living storm of muscle, dust, and willpower. There were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when Scorpus felt weightless. The crowd disappeared, the dust parted, and he could feel the pulse of the horses as if it were his own heartbeat. Those moments were his reward. The illusion of control over chaos, of mastery over fate. Yet every time the gates opened, the gods rolled their dice again. One stumble, one cracked wheel, one frightened horse, and the fastest man in Rome could become another corpse on the sand. But Scorpus had never been one for safety. He was born in the dust, and he intended to die in the wind. As Scorpus' victories multiplied, so did his fortune. By his Middantes, he was richer than most senators. The prize money from over 2,000 wins was staggering, each victory worth bags of gold, jewels, or even villas. He had gone from slave to superstar, from obscurity to a man cheered by emperors. Rome had never seen anything like him. He bought his freedom early, but the arena wouldn't let him go. The Greens offered him a luxurious estate, chariots crafted by the best artisans, and servants to tend to his every whim. His likeness appeared on oil lamps, mosaics, and drinking cups. Graffiti praising him covered tavern walls. Victory to Scorpus. He drives like the wind. Even noble women whispered his name behind silk fans. Rome's most desirable bachelor was also its most dangerous man. The Emperor Decian himself invited Scorpus to imperial banquets, seating him near senators who once wouldn't have let him clean their sandals. But the fame had edges sharper than a chariot's blade. To some, he was a hero. To others, a reminder that Rome's hierarchy was fragile. A former slave, richer than patricians, adored by the mob. It was both intoxicating and threatening. Despite the wealth and flattery, Scorpus lived simply. His heart belonged to the track. He spent his days training horses, perfecting turns, studying his rivals' weaknesses. When asked why he kept racing, he supposedly replied, "The crowd doesn't cheer for rest." To disappoint Rome was unthinkable. The city demanded spectacle, and he was its favorite offering. But even the crowd's love grew greedy. They expected miracles every race. When he won, they roared his name as if he were divine. When he stumbled, they booed with the same ferocity. Scorpus understood the fickleness of fame. It was like his horses, powerful, beautiful, and easily lost. Still, when he rode, everything else vanished. The politics, the expectations, the danger. Gone, only the wind, the thunder of hooves, and the taste of dust remained. For those few minutes in the Circus Maximus, Scorpus wasn't a freeman or a pawn of the greens. He was Rome itself, wild, glorious, and doomed to burn out faster than anyone could imagine. The crowds saw only triumph, never the toll. Every race that Scorpus won carved a little more life out of him. The body of a charioteer aged faster than a soldier's. His hands were a map of scars. His knees shattered from years of standing on a wooden plank as the chariot jolted and slammed through turns. His back ached constantly, his lungs burned from breathing dust and ash, and his eyes squinted against the blinding sun and grit of the track. He was barely 26, and already an old man by the standards of his trade. Few charioteers lived past 30. The circus had its heroes, but it buried them young. Their names were carved into tombs, not triumphal arches. Every driver knew it. Scorpus knew it best. Yet every dawn he strapped the reins around his waist again and stepped into the same chariot that might kill him. Some said he was addicted to the speed. Others whispered that he was cursed, that no man could win that often without the gods demanding payment. Rome loved him, but the city's love was cruel. The same crowds that cheered him would cheer his death. Should it come spectacularly enough, there were omens, too. A chariot wheel that cracked before a race, the sudden death of one of his favorite horses, strange dreams that left him shaken. His friends begged him to slow down, to retire while still whole. He smiled and waved them off. The race ends when the sand drinks the blood, he joked. The kind of joke only a man who's tasted death could make. Still, the unease grew. His rivals muttered that he'd tempted fate too long. Priests warned that Fortuna's wheel turned fastest for those at the top. But Scorpus couldn't stop. For him, life outside the circus wasn't life at all. The roar of the crowd, the trembling ground, the moment when the horses broke free from the gates, that was his existence. And somewhere deep down, he must have known that his next victory could be his last. Rome didn't build legends to last forever. It built them to burn brilliantly and then vanish in the dust. It was a cold morning in the winter of 95 CE when Scorpus climbed into his chariot for what would become his final race. The sky above the Circus Maximus was a flat grey sheet, the kind of light that dulled the shine of the armor and made the dust look like ash. The crowd didn't care. They filled the stands as they always did, roaring for the greens, the blues, the reds, the whites. But when Scorpus appeared at the starting gates, even the noise shifted. Rome knew greatness when it saw it. The horses, Sella, Velosa, Catinus, and Sparsus, stamped and snorted, sensing the tension. Scorpus leaned forward, murmuring to them as he always did, steadying their breath and his own. He had done this thousands of times. But that morning, something in him felt distant, as though he were watching himself from outside his body. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was fate. The horn sounded. The gates flew open. 12 chariots burst forward like a storm unchained. Dust exploded into the air. The roar of the crowd became a single endless wave. Scorpus took the inner track, his signature move, cutting so tight the wheels grazed to the turning post. He was in second place by the 4th lap, his green tunic stare with sweat and grime. Then it happened. On the 6th lap, as he rounded the bend, one of his horses stumbled, the left rein snapped. A rare, almost impossible accident. In that instant, the perfect harmony between man and beast shattered. The chariot lurched, spun, and tipped. The wheels struck the barrier, splintering like bone. The reins tied around his waist dragged him beneath his own team. The crowd gasped, a sound louder than thunder, than silence. By the time the dust settled, Scorpus lay motionless in the sand, his body mangled by the very power that had made him immortal. The Greens stopped cheering. Even the Blues lowered their banners. Rome had seen thousands of deaths in its arenas, but this one struck deeper because for the first time, the greatest racer in history had lost a race not to another man, but to destiny itself. When the race was over, the crowd did not cheer. A silence heavier than stone hung over the Circus Maximus. The emperor's attendants covered their faces. Even the bookkeepers, who recorded every lap and every wager, stopped writing. Scorpus was gone. He had died instantly. His spine snapped, his body broken beneath the hooves of his own horses. But in Rome, death was not the end. It was the beginning of legend. Within hours, word spread through the city. From the Subura to the Palatine Hill, people whispered, "Scorpus is dead." Tavern patrons slammed their cups down in disbelief. Boys who had dreamed of driving for the Greens wept in the streets. The graffiti artists who had once written "Victory to Scorpus" now scrolled new words. Rome mourns her champion. The Greens held his funeral with imperial honors. His body was carried through the streets draped in emerald cloth, his helmet shining in the sunlight one last time. Musicians played duos, while the crowd threw flowers and laurel wreaths along the path. The emperor himself ordered a monument built, a marble relief showing Scorpus holding the palm of victory forever frozen in triumph. His epitaph, found centuries later, read, "I am Scorpus, carried off by the envy of swift fate at the age of 26, after winning 2,000 victories. Even in death, the record stood unmatched. He had lived faster and brighter than anyone of his age, and Rome never forgot. In time, his story became a symbol of glory, of mortality, of Rome's insatiable hunger for spectacle. Later, racers invoked his name before entering the arena, praying for even a fragment of his luck and his courage. The poets compared him to Achilles, doomed to greatness that could not last. And though centuries passed, the dust of the Circus Maximus still holds his ghost. Archaeologists have found carvings of his name on walls, tiny tokens stamped with his likeness, and the faint traces of hoofprints in the hardened sand. Each fragment whispers the same truth. Scorpus may have died young, but he never truly stopped racing. His wheels still turn in Rome's memory, forever chasing the finish line, where mortals become immortal. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was not just a place for exercise. It was a sanctuary where body and spirit met the divine. Every major city-state had one. A sprawling complex of colonnades, training yards, and shaded courtyards lined with olive trees. Young men came not only to build strength, but to cultivate a right, That perfect harmony of body, mind, and virtue the Greeks saw as the highest human calling. The word gymnasium itself came from gymnos, naked to train. Nude was not scandalous, but sacred. The Greeks believed the human form was a reflection of the gods. Every muscle, every sinew, a testament to divine craftsmanship. The gymnasium was a stage for that perfection, a place where mortals could strive to reach the balance and beauty of Olympus. At dawn, the athletes arrived, carrying small jars of olive oil. The air was cool, still heavy with the scent of dew and laurel leaves. Before the first exercises began, each man cleansed himself in the baths, washing away the dust of the city and the impurities of the night. Then came silence. The pedo tribes, the trainer, raised his hands toward the sky and led a prayer to Zeus, Hermes, and Heracles, gods of competition, speed, and strength. Sometimes a small offering was placed at a nearby altar. A few drops of oil, a laurel branch, or a libation of wine. The young athletes stood still, their oiled skin glistening under the morning sun. This was not mere vanity, it was ritual. The oil symbolized vitality, the divine fire within. It protected the body and honored the gods who granted strength. Once anointed, they dusted themselves with fine sand from the training yard to give grip, but also to connect flesh with earth, mortal with eternal. When the prayers were done, the courtyard came alive. The crack of discus, the thud of javelins, the rhythmic shouts of men wrestling on the ground. Yet beneath the sweat and exertion, everything was bound by reverence. The gymnasium was not only where champions were made, it was where citizens learned to worship through motion. To sweat in Greece was to pray. Before a single muscle flexed, before a single discus flew, the Greek athlete began his ritual with oil. Olive oil, the lifeblood of Greece, was sacred. It came from the groves of Athena herself, pressed in bronze vats, stored in small alabaster flasks called araboi. To anoint the body with oil was not mere preparation, it was devotion. The act transformed the athlete from an ordinary man into something almost divine. In the soft morning light, the men gathered in the apichin, the undressing room. There they stripped bare, leaving behind their cloaks, sandals, and all marks of status. Nobles and commoners stood side by side, equal under the gaze of the gods. Slaves held out the oil, and the athletes rubbed it across their skin, slow, deliberate strokes that gleamed under the rising sun. The fragrance filled the air, sharp, green, and clean, mixed with the faint metallic taints of bronze. Oiling the body had practical purposes. It softened the skin, prevented injury, and trapped warmth. But the deeper meaning was spiritual. The olive tree was sacred to Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, and its oil symbolized purity and strength. To oil the body was to invite divine favor, to ask the goddess to dwell within the limbs that would soon test their limits. After anointing came the stridle, made of bronze or iron. The curved blade was used to scrape away the mixture of oil, sweat, and dust that clung to the skin after training. The scraping made a rasping sound, rhythmic and oddly soothing. The residue, a greyish paste, was collected in jars, sometimes even sold for its supposed healing powers. To the Greeks, even the sweat of athletes carried sacred energy. When their bodies shone like polished marble, the athletes stood ready, their skin glowing, their hearts steady, their minds focused. Every movement from that moment forward was ritual. The oil was not armor, but offering. It was said that a well-oiled body pleased the gods as much as the sight of a well-tuned lyre. In Greece, beauty was holiness, and the glistening bodies of the gymnasium were hymns sung in motion. Once their skin gleamed with oil, the athletes performed the next step in their sacred transformation. They dusted themselves with sand. It was not random dirt from the ground, but fine sved dust from the palestra, the wrestling yard. Trainers kept piles of it near the edges of the court, gathered from years of sweat and footprints. This was the conies, the sacred dust. It clung to the skin like a second blessing. Practically, the sand prevented athletes from slipping during wrestling or losing grip in combat sports. But its meaning reached far deeper. Oil symbolized divine favor. Dust symbolized mortality. Together they created balance, body and soul, heaven and earth. To coat one's oiled body in sand was to acknowledge that every man, no matter how strong, was still bound to the soil of Gaia. The Greeks saw beauty in this contradiction, perfection wrapped in impermanence. In the gymnasium, trainers moved among the men, ensuring each athlete was properly anointed and dusted. They praised those who struck the right balance. Not too oily, not dry. Too much oil, they said, and you slip from victory. Too much dust, and you bury yourself before the fight. It was philosophy made physical. Moderation, the Greek ideal, turned into ritual. Once prepared, the athletes tested their bodies. They flexed and stretched, sand shifting on their skin like gold in sunlight. To the onlookers, philosophers, poets, and spectators, the sight bordered on divine. The human form, sculpted and shining, became the very image of Olympus. In fact, many sculptors later modeled statues of gods after the men of the gymnasium, their poses born from these warm-ups and rituals. Before sparring began, each athlete often reached down, scooping a handful of dust, pressing it to his chest, and whispering a short prayer, sometimes to Zeus, sometimes to Heracles, patron of strength. They believed that in that grainy embrace between flesh and earth, they found divine connection. The gymnasium floor shimmered, not with blood or violence, but with bodies kissed by oil and dust. It was here that the Greeks found holiness not in temples, but in motion itself, in the sacred choreography of mortals striving to resemble gods. Before the first race was run, before the first discus cut the air, every athlete in Greece turned to the gods. The gymnasium was sacred, but competition was divine theater, a ritual performance offered to Olympus itself. Every contest began not with movement, but with prayer. The athletes gathered before small altars built at the edges of the training grounds, usually dedicated to Zeus, Hermes, or Heracles, gods of strength, speed, and struggle. The air was thick with incense. A priest or elder stepped forward, carrying a bowl of grain or wine. Silence fell. Even the chatter of the spectators quieted, for the Greeks believed that the gods watched every match as eagerly as mortals did. The priest raised his hands and spoke words that had echoed across centuries. Grant these men strength without hubris, courage without rage, and victory worthy of the gods. Each athlete then offered his own private prayer. Some knelt, others simply bowed their heads. They might whisper to Hermes for speed, to Apollo for grace, to Zeus for triumph, or to Nike, the winged goddess of victory, asking that her favor rest lightly upon their shoulders. The offerings were simple but symbolic. Small cakes of barley, splashes of oil, or sprigs of laurel. No athlete dared enter the field without honoring the divine order that governed both fate and fortune. To compete without prayer was unthinkable, almost blasphemous. It meant arrogance, the worst sin in the Greek world. Even champions knew their victories were borrowed, gifts lent by the gods that could be snatched away without warning. Many athletes made vows before the games. If they won, they would dedicate their olive crown to Zeus, or donate their prize money to the local temple. When the prayers ended, the tension broke. The crowd erupted in cheers. Flutes began to play, and the competitors stepped onto the sand, their bodies gleaming, their spirits calm. The Greeks believed that prayer aligned the human heart with the divine rhythm of the cosmos. In that still moment between supplication and competition, mortal and God stood side by side. The contest that followed was not mere sport. It was worship made visible. When the prayers ended, training began, not as chaos, but as a carefully choreographed ritual. The gymnasium was a symphony of motion. In one corner, wrestlers locked arms in clouds of dust, their muscles straining under the morning light. In another, runners sprinted along the zistos, their feet striking the packed earth with rhythmic precision. The sounds of exertion, grunts, shouts, and the crack of javelins echoed beneath marble colonnades. Training in Greece was as much philosophy as it was physical mastery. Each discipline represented a virtue. Wrestling taught endurance and cunning. Running built perseverance. The discus demanded grace. The javelin required precision. To train the body was to discipline the soul. No man can be free, said the philosopher Epictetus, who is not master of himself. The gymnasium was where that mastery began. The pedo tribes, the trainer, watched closely. His voice carried across the yard, instructing, correcting, commanding. He was part teacher, part priest, part sculptor, shaping human clay into ideals of perfection. Beside him stood the elliptes, the oiler, who rubbed down tired limbs, massaged cramped muscles, and anointed bruises with warm oil and herbs. The process was intimate, rhythmic, and revered. Every movement was intentional. The Greeks did not train for chaos. They trained for harmony. Before throwing a discus, an athlete would pause, breathe, and visualize its flight. Before wrestling, he studied his opponent's stance, not to dominate him brutally, but to outthink him. Mind and body acted as one. The goal was not simply victory, but superazine, balance, restraint, self-awareness. Spectators sometimes gathered along the peristyle to watch. They came not for entertainment, but for inspiration. To see a man move with perfect rhythm and control was to glimpse divine order in human form. Plato himself once said that watching a trained body was like reading philosophy in motion. By midday, the courtyard shimmered with heat and the athletes' bodies glistened with oil and dust. The training ended as it began, in ritual calm. They stood together in silence, breathing deeply, their hearts steady. The gymnasium was not only a place to prepare for competition, it was a living altar where Greece worshipped the body as the bridge between Earth and Olympus. The gymnasium was more than a place of training. It was a brotherhood. Within its marble walls, men of every background came together. Farmers, soldiers, poets, and aristocrats. Here, rank meant nothing. Every man stripped bare, united by sweat, discipline, and shared devotion to the gods. The equality of the gymnasium was sacred, a reminder that before the gods, all mortals were the same. Conversations flowed freely between exercises. Young men debated philosophy as they rested beneath the porticos. What is virtue? One might ask, while rubbing the dust from his shoulders. Another would quote a line from Homer or challenge a companion to a race to settle the matter. Socrates himself was said to have frequented gymnasia, arguing ideas of courage and love among the athletes. The Greek gymnasium, in this way, became both a school and a sanctuary, a place where the mind trained as rigorously as the body. Older men served as mentors, teaching not only techniques, but ideals, humility in victory, dignity in defeat, and respect. renewed. It was said that these baths were where true friendships and sometimes political alliances were born. Yet, this brotherhood wasn't purely physical. It carried moral weight. To betray your comrades in the gymnasium was to betray your city. To train without integrity was to insult the gods. The gymnasium shaped not just athletes but citizens, men whose strength served community before self. In the rhythm of shared training, the Greeks found something eternal: unity through excellence, to sweat beside another man was to understand him. To compete honorably was to love him as a brother. And in that brotherhood, the Greeks believed the divine could dwell among mortals. All the discipline of the gymnasium led to one purpose: the sacred games. For the Greeks, competition was not simply sport. It was ritual worship. Each major festival from the Olympic to the Python was held in honor of a god. The gymnasium served as the forge where athletes were refined for this divine theater. When the time came, the competitors left the training yards and journeyed to Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, or Isthmia, places where mortals met the gaze of immortals. Before the games began, the athletes swore an oath at the altar of Zeus, promising to play fair, to cheat neither man nor god. Sacrifices were offered: oxmen, doves, libations of wine, and the smoke rose into the summer air, carrying prayers to the heavens. Then the contestants entered the stadium barefoot and glistening, their bodies gleaming with the same olive oil that had sanctified their training. The spectators filled the stands, chanting city names, waving branches of laurel and olive. The games were more than entertainment. They were living proof that excellence was divine. The Greeks believed that when a man pushed his body to its limits in honest struggle, the gods watched with delight. To win was not just fortune, it was a sign of divine favor. Every event had its own rhythm of ritual. Runners stood at the starting line, touching the earth before rising to salute Zeus. Wrestlers poured oil on their arms, then dust, each movement deliberate, almost prayer-like. Javelin throwers traced the flight of their weapon in the air before releasing it, whispering Hermes' name. Even the noise of the crowd carried a sacred energy, a collective hymn to human glory. Victory was rewarded not with gold, but with a simple wreath of wild olive or laurel, a crown more powerful than any jewel. The winner's name was carved into stone, sung by poets, and painted on vases. He would return home as a hero, paraded through his city, sometimes fed for life at public expense. But the Greeks never saw these contests as mortal vanity. They were offerings, gifts of muscle, sweat, and endurance to the gods who had given man his strength. In the sand and the sunlight, the line between athlete and deity blurred. When the contests ended and the shouting of the crowd faded into memory, the rituals of the gymnasium were not over. Victory or defeat mattered less than purification, for both were gifts from the gods. Every athlete, bruised and coated in dust, returned to the lutron, the bathhouse adjoining the training grounds. It was here that the physical and spiritual cleansing began. The attendants prepared basins of cool water mixed with herbs and oils. Bronze stridles glinted in the lamplight, ready to scrape away the day's labor. The athletes stood silently as the ellipse the oiler poured water over their shoulders. The first sound was always the same: the hiss of water meeting hot skin, followed by the rhythmic scrape of metal. Oil, sweat, and sand came away in grey ribbons, leaving the body bare again, renewed, almost reborn. But this cleansing was more than hygiene. It was a symbolic act, a shedding of mortal toil. The Greeks believed that competition, though sacred, stirred powerful passions: pride, envy, wrath. To cleanse the body was to restore harmony to the soul. Even the victors submitted humbly to the ritual, for arrogance before the gods was unforgivable. The loser, meanwhile, was comforted with equal reverence. Both had honored Zeus with their effort, and the water erased all differences. Once clean, the athletes were anointed again with fresh olive oil, not for battle, but for peace. The scent of the oil mingled with incense, rising from nearby altars. Priests offered thanks for the safe return of all competitors, while poets recited hymns celebrating the day's contests. The gymnasium, once roaring with exertion, now echoed softly with murmured prayers and splashing water. In the evenings, men gathered under the colonnades to eat, discuss philosophy, and reflect on the lessons of the day. For the Greeks, the cleansing after the contest completed the sacred cycle: struggle, purification, and reflection. It reminded them that strength without humility was meaningless. By nightfall, the courtyard glowed with torchlight, the air rich with oil and laurel smoke. The athletes' bodies, now clean and calm, seemed carved from marble once more. In their quiet stillness, the Greeks saw something divine, proof that through ritual and discipline, even mortals could touch eternity.